Hey everyone, I'm not here with an unboxing this time. I had been wanting to do a video that was sort of another state of the movies like I had been doing, almost like bi-weekly at one point, but I kind of wanted to wait until there was enough data or things we could sort of look at. So I thought like an overview of the summer and a little bit trickling into where we are now, I'm recording this on Indigenous Peoples Day in October, would be a good sort of macro view of where we attempt to be, because they really started opening up the vaccine to people around like March and April of 2021, and then it was opened up to everyone above the age of 12, I think, in May, or it was at least 17 and up in May, and then they opened it up to 12 and up a little bit later. But then you had the Delta variant, and then that started to tamp things down a bit. We started seeing, the optimistic grosses from Memorial Day with Cruella and Quiet Place 2 sort of dip around, and then so we saw, Black Widow seemed like it was disappointing, and then you had it started to kick up again with Shang-Chi, and now going into Venom and No Time to Die. So there was a lot of stuff waxing and waning, so I wrote myself a couple cheat sheet notes of what I wanted to talk about, and sort of what we can sort of view the state of the theatrical movie theater experience is like now, and how that business is looking. So first thing I want to talk about is just, the pandemic. That is still the main punching down to what's going on here. So you started to see movie theater grosses started ticking up when the product arguably became more mainstream. You saw that with Godzilla and Kong, which was released in March. But then people started getting the vaccine, and so we started to see numbers that were starting to tick up a little bit more normally. Again, we saw that sort of 1-2 punch after Memorial Day of Quiet Place 2 and Cruella. Quiet Place 2 was theatrical exclusive for about 45 days. Cruella was also offered for $30 on Disney Plus at the same time. But then the weeks prior to that, it was just kind of like Wrath of Man and a couple other things that were underperforming, Spiral from the Book of Saw. You start to see grosses weren't quite there, but then, that sort of blockbuster 1-2 punch started to make things kind of look all right. And then things were kind of like middling a bit in June. And then you kind of saw the Delta variant, and then that started to sort of tamp things down a bit. But you still saw some movies being rather successful. F9, it didn't do as well as F7, which seems to be the high benchmark box office-wise for that series. But it still did a reasonably good number, considering, that was also theatrical exclusive for a bit. Black Widow did okay, not very good as far as a Marvel movie's concerned, but then that also had a $30 PVOD thing, and Disney took the extraordinary step for them of announcing how much it made in that first weekend on Disney Plus with the $30 price tag. I think they did something similar with Jungle Cruise, which also did, okay-ish numbers, though Jungle Cruise ended up legging out a lot better than Black Widow did. Black Widow kind of dropped like a rock, then we had that lawsuit, and then that got settled. I really wish that would have gotten to the discovery phase of trial, because I would have really liked to see some of those documents about their internal business-making decision, but, they cut ScarJo a check. So, and so you kind of saw that once that Delta variant, or the fears of the Delta variant hit, and then mask mandates went away and then were brought back in some places, and then some places were asking for a vaccine proof, which then cut people under 12 from being able to get into theaters. So New York City, I think it might even be the entire state of New York did that. I think LA County's doing it next, if they haven't already. So that was kind of cutting a lot of family movies, and that's why you've seen stuff like Hotel Transylvania 4, which, oddly enough, Adam Sandler didn't do a voice in. That was sold off to, I think, Amazon. Addams Family 2, the animated film, that went to PVOD at the same time as Theatrical. So Clifford got punched back. You got to see, because of studios seem to be worried that because kids can't get into the movies at all, because if you're under 12, you just can't get vaccinated, so you're not going to have vaccination proof, and neither one's going to let you in. That the family movies have kind of gotten pushed back or sold off still, even though family movies in the early part of the pandemic, like Croods and stuff, were doing reasonably well. But that vaccine fear, or the lack of vaccination among the populace, and so the Delta variant fears, has suppressed some stuff. The movies that you're starting to see be successful right now, your Shang-Chi's, your Venom, aside from being big Marvel movies, or Sony is like kind of Marvel, is that they aim at a younger demographic, which 20s, maybe even early 30s, certainly teens, people who would be probably more risk averse or less risk averse about COVID than older audiences. Older audiences seem to be reticent to come back to the theater, so you're seeing a lot of adult-aimed dramas or art house fare are still struggling a bit. Like, you're seeing movies like that Anthony Bourdain documentary did okay in limited release, as did Nicolas Cage's Pig. But a lot of those movies are really trying to crawl up to get that business. Lamb just opened this weekend. It did okay. Card Counter, again, did okay. Titan is not doing as well at the box office as it probably should because it's a really good movie, but it's certainly not mainstream. Neither is Lamb, to be quite honest. A lot of those movies are still trying to claw because a lot of those art house movies are actually driven by older audiences, which seem to be a bit more fearful of going back to the theater. And even this weekend, after Venom over-indexed and did like 90 million domestic, people are like, well, the sky's the limit for No Time to Die, and what they fail to realize is that the Bond movies always skew to an older demographic. That also, it's almost 3 hours, so that older demographic, if they're still a little bit more fearful to go back to the theater, that's why it sort of came up at the low end of expectations. Still a good opening. I think it's going to top out a little under 60 mil this weekend. I'm recording this on Monday, so the numbers are still in flux, which is still good for a Bond movie, but I think people's expectations were a little too high once they saw what Venom did, because Venom definitely blew the roof off the theaters. People were very surprised that it did as much as it did. I was surprised, but maybe that 90-minute runtime helped it push in more screenings. So you're definitely seeing that the pandemic is still affecting things. Not as many people are afraid to go back to the theater, and we're seeing grosses start to look more normal for these blockbuster movies, especially ones that aim at a younger audience. But for limited release movies, well, even now, limited release movies, they're not opening in like 2-3 theaters and then gradually opening anymore. Like, Lamb is a movie that normally would open on like 20 screens and then in 2 weeks it'd be on maybe 900, but they seem to be kind of pushing them all out the door right away to front load that box office gross, and then they kicked them to PVOD in 15-20 days. Because, again, a lot of the audience for that movie is still kind of afraid to go to the theater. I mean, it's a little odd for Lamb and Titan because those seem to also be marketed toward horror audiences, which can sometimes skew younger. And I don't really see a lot of, 50-year-old art house crowds really going for Titan. Lamb a little bit more, because Lamb's not actually a horror movie. I saw it this past weekend. I liked it. A24 is marketing it as a horror, and it's not. It's more of a folktale. Titan fits pretty well into body horror, though. I'm comfortable calling that a horror movie. That's probably not the same people who are going to see Tragedy of Macbeth later, when A24 and Apple put that one out. So, how the pandemic, it's negatively affecting family films, because if certain jurisdictions are requiring a vax card to get into the theater, under 12 can't get vaxxed yet. And that might change in the next month or so. It's affecting older audiences, which, vaccinated or not, they're a bit more scared to come back to the theater, so art house fare that's aimed at an older audience, even blockbusters like No Time to Die that's aimed at an older audience, and these sort of mid-budgeted or even kind of low-budgeted films aimed at a more mature adult audience. Blue Bayou didn't do too well in theaters. It was like in theaters for 1 week and then went to PVOD, and stuff like that is struggling. But the big blockbusters that are aimed at younger audiences, so teens, 20s, maybe early 30s, those are just people a little bit younger than me, basically. I'm in my late 30s. Those movies, they're starting to come back up. Venom ended up grossing more than the first Venom did in its opening weekend. It dropped a little bit more in the second, but that's to be expected. Shang-Chi still did really well, because A, it had no competition in September, and B, because there was no PVOD element to it, it legged out much better than Black Widow did and stuff like that. But that, I guess, brings me to my next point. Aside from how the pandemic's affecting, at-home options are definitely... I was looking at my notes there. At-home options are definitely affecting it. When you look at the movies that are theatrical exclusive, those movies are legging out more. They're making more money week to week to week, and staying in theaters longer than the ones that have a PVOD option. The biggest example of this, I think, aside from Shang-Chi, but before that, was Free Guy. Free Guy opened at a pretty decent but modest opening weekend, and then it was very successful week after week after week before it launched on PVOD, because it didn't have an at-home element. And you're seeing this with a lot. Shang-Chi later on, Quiet Place back in May. Any movie that was theatrical exclusive was doing a lot better in theaters, which just makes sense. Because when you have an at-home option, the people who are scared to go to the theaters, they'll just rent it that way. If you're, if the average movie theater ticket is maybe $10, here it's about 12 to 15 where I live, but countrywide it's probably closer to 10. If you have more than 2 people in your household watching the movie, you're already saving money there, not to mention saving concession prices if you buy snacks and whatever. And also, if you offer an at-home option, you're basically offering a piracy option. So a lot of people will just also, they'll fire up their VPN and download a torrent of it. So that's probably what happened with Black Widow. That's why it sunk like a fucking rock at the theater. And anything that had an at-home option like that, whether it was the $30 PVOD that Disney was offering, or the normal $19.99 PVOD you can get from, Apple, iTunes, Amazon, Vudu, wherever you rent your PVOD movies. And that's really hurting. I think the piracy issue especially is hurting because not every movie opens day and date all around the world. So if a movie opens on PVOD in the US and it's yet to open as a theatrical exclusive in the UK, Germany, Australia, China, whatever, people from those countries will just pirate it and then they'll watch it ahead of time and all that stuff. So that's definitely cutting into that bottom line. Now, without being able to look at the studio's accounting books, we don't know if they're making that up. They might be like, hey, we'll put it on PVOD. We know that we're going to lose 10-15% of our business to piracy, but the money we're making up is still more than we'd make theatrically, and whatever theatrical run we do basically serves as our advertisement for our PVOD, because we can pretend it's a better movie than a normal direct-to-video movie because we had a small theatrical release. Which is why you're seeing other movies like that horrible Nick Cage that I went to see, Prisoners of Ghostland, have like a 1-week engagement in theaters and stuff like that. And Netflix is doing that more too. They did a 1-week engagement with The Guilty with Jake Gyllenhaal, which was a good movie. They did it with Army of the Dead for Zack Snyder at the earlier part of the summer. So you're seeing stuff like that too. But it's possible that they're thinking, hey, we'll still make more money by putting it on PVOD than if we did theatrical exclusive. And then what people are arguing against that is that it's still hurting downstream revenue. Because you have to remember, before this PVOD thing, the business model was you had a theatrical release, you made money that way, and then you offered it on probably digital after that, a digital rent or digital buy, and you made money that way. And then you put it on physical media for the physical media people like myself, and you made money that way, though that revenue is obviously shrinking to more of the collector and hardcore market, so the people like me, the people who buy from Vinegar Syndrome and Severin and all of the boutique labels and that kind of thing, or buy the Best Buy Steelbooks and things like that. And then you have, things like the cable TV rights, like FX. FX buys the rights to like every fucking blockbuster movie so that in 3 years they can show it on TV with commercials. Or, other streaming services that, didn't produce it, but they still buy like streaming rights. So, your HBOs and your Paramount Plus, it's like, hey, it's not a Paramount movie, but we'll buy the pay +2 window or what have you, and we'll stream it in, 9 months or whatever. And it seems like if a movie skips theatrical and is released just PVOD, or if it has a hybrid component of PVOD and theatrical, they're making less money on all of those downstream ancillary ways. So that while they may front load more money than they would if they went theatrical exclusive, they're cutting the neck off, and they're not making as much on all that downstream stuff, because once you've put that out and there's a pirated version, then you're devaluing or you're losing some of the equity of that product than you would if you followed the traditional model. And so that's why I think if that is true, and without being able to look at all of the studio's books, we don't know if that's true, but that's what people seem to be thinking. When you read the trade papers, Variety, Hollywood Reporter, these news organizations that are sort of aimed at people within the industry, that seems to be what the consensus is. So I think that's a dark secret no one's talking about, where it's like the studio will release it on PVOD because that'll bolster their immediate numbers, that'll help their stock price then, but they don't care about the ancillary revenue, even though that'll hurt the company and their stockholders in the long run, because they're just worried about the short-term games, and then they feel like they can jump ship to a different company after, and they won't feel the negative effects of their decisions. That seems to be where they're going now. But you're starting to see now is that this offering this at-home thing doesn't seem like it's going to be the same. It seems like we're going to have a shortened theatrical window from what it was previously, unless your name is Christopher Nolan, where it used to be about 90 to 120, and we're probably going to see closer to a 45 to 70 day when all's said and done. Even studios that were offering day and date, and we're not even talking about PVOD, but if it just goes straight to streaming with no extra upcharge, so like what Warner Brothers was doing with all of their movies, putting on HBO Max, they're not doing that next year. Next year they're going to follow more of the traditional or the new traditional window. They're not putting it day and date for free. Because what you've seen from those movies, the ones that offer a PVOD option, sometimes they've done all right. The ones that have gone day and date with another streaming service, where they're free if you just subscribe to the streaming service, those have all been consistently underperforming. You've seen some that have made an okay box office gross domestically. Your Conjuring 3s, your Space Jam New Legacies, those have done okay, but Sopranos movie pretty much bombed. Suicide Squad, James Gunn's, which was a really good movie, absolutely bombed. That movie did not make nearly as much as it would if it was there, which makes me a little bit worried about how Dune's going to do. Dune at least has had like a month head start overseas, but it doesn't seem like it's going to make a profit if it does this, and then we're not going to get part 2, and I wanted to see part 2. But almost everything, aside from a couple of those ones I've pointed out, that Warner Brothers' release has been a disaster. Even 'Malignant, which took horror Twitter by storm, and I went to go see it in a theater after word of mouth was talking about it, and it's, I'm not going to call it a good movie, but it is fun, and that third act is great. But even stuff like that, it's been a death sentence for pretty much almost all of Warner Brothers' entire theatrical slate this year, because they decided to try to boost HBO Max subscriptions, which they did. But that also is a weird thing to look at for revenue, because unlike PVOD, where you're still making extra money off of that one movie, where someone can say X amount of dollars came because they rented this movie, we can draw the money directly to that movie. But HBO Max is a little harder. Like, you can look at Many Saints of Newark, and you can be like, well, how many subscribers did we gain the Thursday before it happened? You can't really, it's harder to judge the monetization of that. But then there could also be people who subscribed 3 months ago and they decided to not cancel their subscription because they wanted to watch this other movie. So it's harder to judge how much value any individual movie brings to your streaming service, which is why it's very hard to judge what the monetary value of something that goes direct to streaming is. Like, I'm sure Netflix and those people have come up with their formula, and that's how they decide how much money they're going to spend on one of their original products, or how much they're going to spend on a different product they acquire, because they're basically not looking for money per product. They're looking at gaining new subscribers or keeping the subscribers they already have, or trying to keep people from password sharing, I guess, is their new thing. So it's a little harder to understand what the monetary value of that stuff is, and I think that's why, another reason why they're going to move away from that, because if you're on the HBO Max side of the house, this has been great for them because they've gained a super amount of subscribers really quickly. But if you're on the film side of it, you have devalued an entire year's worth of products. And you still have Dune coming out, you still have Matrix coming out, you still have a couple big ticket items for the remainder, for the last 2.5 months of this year, and it's not so much. It's really weird that Universal has decided to put Halloween Kills on Peacock as well. And I read an interview with Jason Blum, and he was like, when Freaky came out, it was theatrical exclusive, and it didn't do too well, and so that has sort of warned him about theatrical exclusive. But I think that's apples and oranges. For one, Freaky was a brand new product. It's based on, or it's part of like this body swap subgenre, but it's its own product. It's not based on any existing IP. And it was released last year in November when there was no vaccine widely available. Now in Halloween Kills, it's a sequel to a very popular box office grossing film from 2018. It's based on the long-running, very strong IP of the Halloween series. Half the country or more is vaccinated. We've pretty much vaccinated everyone except for the right-wing assholes who won't, and maybe they'll die off before this happens. Or maybe they'll be forced by their employer and they'll finally submit to it. And so it's a different environment, but I guess Universal wants to bolster their Peacock Plus because The Office isn't enough to get people to subscribe to it. I don't know. So we're doing that, but it seems like the direction they're moving toward is they've sort of realized that releasing a movie in theaters and free streaming at the same time it's probably not very helpful for the bottom line. You'll get a boost of subscribers to your service, but it probably doesn't even out money-wise, especially with how much these movies cost. And that's why you're starting to see that some of these streaming services they're starting to focus more on big ticket original movies that are just for their service. Like the new Paranormal Activity, that's not even going to theaters, that's just going solely to Paramount Plus, and they're also making more South Park and Beavis and Butthead movies and stuff like that. You're probably going to see more of that than you're going to see movies that are going into theaters and for free day and date at the same time. Maybe not with the family movies. Boss Baby, the sequel, did fairly well in theaters for a family movie at this point in time, and that was day and date with Paramount Plus, and I think Paw Patrol, the same thing happened. As far as PVOD, you'll probably see some movies still do that, but it's going to depend. My guess is a lot of independent films will probably still do the PVOD thing, at least until older audiences are ready to come back to the theater, and the traditional limited release where you start small and then gradually open up city to city can be profitable again. Because right now, you're seeing all these small independent movies open way wider than they ever would before. Which is great if you live in like a rural area where your theater usually only carries big blockbusters and doesn't get movies like Pig or Lamb or A24 Neon stuff. It's great for you because you're getting access to movies that would have never opened in your location. But if you live in a more metropolitan area like I do, we get that. My Alamo gets plenty of movies that no other theaters in the area carry. So it's a little different. So let's see. What I talked about: at-home options, piracy, which is also a big thing, product. Part of why some movies aren't doing so well, or why the movies, is because for a while it seemed like the studios were still holding off on some of their bigger ticket items, and they were pushing them back for various reasons. But it's possible that a lot of the stuff that they were biting the bullet and releasing was just stuff that didn't have a lot of oomph. It wasn't enough to get people to the theater if they were reticent. And we kind of saw this a little bit with some of the movies that were kind of more unsuccessful. In the Heights seemed to have been, people thought it was, or some people, at least in the mainstream Hollywood press, thought it had the potential to be like as big as Hamilton because it's from the same guy. And it did really well in reviews, and then it flopped. Now, part of that flop was because it was on HBO Max day and date. And it's also, in my opinion, a mediocre film that's not really about anything. A lot of people liked it. I seem to be in the minority as far as reviews of that movie go, but I was not very impressed with the film. And it seems like you had movies like that were coming out throughout the summer, in between the wannabe blockbusters, and some were blockbusters and some weren't. And it was like, it's like Wrath of Man was a movie I really liked, but it didn't bring people into theaters. And you started to kind of see stuff like that. And, now that studios are getting a bit more comfortable, like, they kind of ping-ponged Venom across it was originally going to open, obviously, most of the stuff was supposed to open in, like, 2019 or 2020, but it was originally set to open in, like, the September, and then they pushed it back to, like, November, and then they pushed it up a couple weeks, and that finally did well. But you've seen other movies, like Jackass got pushed back to next year, even though that movie would probably do well in this environment. It's a fairly low budget. It's aimed at a younger audience. It's, it probably would have done fine in theaters. They really need to push it back, but maybe they did that because of the Bam Margera lawsuit. Who knows? But it seems like now we're finally getting more mainstream product. You had your F9 and your Black Widow in the summer. And then other things that were pretty successful, like Jungle Cruise and stuff. But you also kind of just had movies that they were kind of just throwing out there from the previous year that they couldn't. And it seems like now that the studios are a bit more calm, they're fine releasing Shang-Chi and Bond and Venom, and later in a couple weeks we'll have like Ghostbusters and West Side Story and Far From Home or No Way Home, Spider-Man and Matrix and stuff. So you're starting to get more blockbuster-ish movies that are kind of coming out now. But for the summer, it was kind of, a little trickle of some other stuff. We had, you had like some horror stuff. Horror was doing pretty well, aside from Malignant. Forever Purge did okay, and Spiral didn't do so well. But Conjuring 3 did okay despite the day and date stuff. So you started to see that some genres were performing better than others, but ultimately it seemed like there wasn't enough oomphy product to really bring in a lot of those audiences. So the dearth of product people wanted to see, or at least mainstream audiences wanted to see, that would bring them out, the studios were still a bit too shy to do that. But now that you're seeing that, it's probably going to get a little bit better as far as like what's coming out in the product is concerned. Let's talk about China. A lot of movies, when they're greenlit now, especially the big blockbuster movies especially, I should talk about that, their budgets are based on what the studio thinks they can do internationally. And after the US, the biggest international market is China. Despite the fact that Hollywood only takes about 25% of the ticket sales that they get from China for various reasons I won't get into here, China is a big money grabber. It is the second biggest movie market, and it's kind of surpassing Hollywood. I mean, if you look at some of the biggest movies that have come out in the past year and a half, it's been Hi Mom and Detective Chinatown 3 and a bunch of these Chinese domestic films, because that market is huge. I mean, aside from the billion people that live in the country, it's a huge money going market. And so a lot of American studios are like, okay, we're okay spending $500 million on this movie between P&A and the actual principal budget, because we know domestic's going to be X, China's going to be Y, and the rest of the world is going to be Z. But here's what happened this summer. China is very picky about how many foreign films they allow, foreign to them films that they allow into their country. Aside from censorship reasons, they kind of want the ratio of their domestic product to outperform or to be larger than the ratio of international product they bring in. So they have a small trickle, and usually Hollywood has to sit on pins and needles to know if their film's going to be released in China and when they're going to allow it to be. And then the month of July is where China has all of their nationalistic propaganda holidays. So they normally cut back on almost all foreign releases in July, and they just release their own stuff. Some of them are propaganda films, some of them are just, they're regular films that they think will be popular. So, and a lot of films fit into both of those Venn diagrams in China. So China, with Marvel, there's an issue. So Shang-Chi, Black Widow didn't get a Chinese release at all, as far as I know. Shang-Chi probably isn't, because the main actor made some comments against the fake Communist Party of China. Sorry, tankies, they're not really communists. And the director of Eternals has also made some comments about the fake Communist Party of China. So already you have 3 big Marvel movies, and Marvel is popular in China, unlike Star Wars and a couple other franchises that don't translate to China as well. That's cutting out a huge part, and I don't see how Marvel can spend that much money on their blockbusters if they're not going to get a piece of the pie from China. So either you're going to start seeing them censor themselves or not hire certain people, or you're going to have to see them cut their budgets to make up for the fact that they're not making any money from China. Plus, the piracy rate in China is probably huge. I'm sure anybody who wanted to see Black Widow in China has already been pirating it, because they can't talk anything about their government, but they can use their VPNs to pirate shit. So that's going to be rough. Now, you did see Free Guy got a release in China, and it did pretty well there. F9 got a release in China. John Cena stepped in it when he made some Taiwan comments, but that didn't seem to affect the release of the movie there. John Cena, he's fluent in Mandarin and actually lived in China for a while, though, so that may have been more about him just wanting to be friendly with China than Universal forcing him to. But I think that's probably going to be a problem because it wasn't just July that China kind of cut the American spigot off. They didn't release almost anything in the month of August either. They finally let Free Guy and the Pixar movie Luca, which didn't get a theatrical release here, went straight to Disney Plus with no upcharge in the US. But you definitely saw that it looks like going forward, China might just let fewer and fewer American movies in than even they used to before. Because it seems like they've gone longer and more far between with when they announce an American movie can be released and what that American movie is. And I don't think Hollywood can afford to spend as much on blockbusters as they are. I mean, they certainly can't if they're going to do any of this PVOD streaming stuff, because they just don't make that much money up front than if they do theatrical exclusive. But if they stick with theatrical exclusive, they still can't spend that much money on it if they can't count on a couple $100 million to come from China. And so, I think, there were, in the early days, I say this, but some of these movies, I think Iron Man 2 maybe, they filmed special scenes for the Chinese market that were only released in China to sort of compensate for that. And then you saw, there's always been some pretty egregious examples of China just kind of sucking China's cock, or America sucking China's cock to get a movie released there. To be one of the few. One of the worst examples was this terrible movie, Now You See Me 2. I like the first Now You See Me fine, the second one's awful. But there's a couple scenes in that second movie take place solely in Macau, which is basically China's version of Vegas. Much like Hong Kong kind of used to be. It was like the one country, two systems thing, where they were slightly freer than the rest of mainland China. They've probably cracked down on Macau, but it just hasn't been as big of news as Hong Kong. But they filmed this entire long sequence in Macau, and I'm pretty sure they did that solely to try and get a Chinese release there. Anytime you see an American movie have scenes set in Hong Kong or China these days, it's usually part of them trying to get their movie a Chinese release. It's always very cynical in that way. So, which is a shame because China is starting to clamp down on the Hong Kong film market. They're going to start retroactively censoring a lot of Hong Kong cinema. It's truly egregious. The state capitalist system of China that pretends they're communist is totally horrible, and no country should call itself communist when the working class does not own the means of production, but what are you going to do? So I'm not a fan of the Chinese government, in case you can tell. But I think you're gonna start to see the budgets of some of these big blockbusters, and I picked the Marvel movies specifically because they are very popular in China, and they were getting Chinese releases up until recent history. Those budgets are gonna have to come down, because if they don't have that Chinese money, they're not gonna hit like that $1 billion profit that they need. That's just not gonna happen. So that's a big thing, and it also it will be interesting to see if this is the long-term strategy of China to bolster up their domestic market, because some of their domestic product has made a lot of money. Right now, there's a movie about the Korean War that has China released, The Battle of Something Something, and that's making a lot of money. Hi Mom, which is basically like this time travel family movie, did really well. There was a couple other movies, 1940-something, the Chinese Revolution movie didn't seem to do too well, but there was other controversies involved with the casting of that movie in China. Apparently they casted China's version of TikTok stars as, like, Chairman Mao, and that didn't go over well with the populace, especially the super nationalist Maoists there. And Detective Chinatown 3, which apparently is a very big series in China. That did a lot of money. Some of these movies opened like bigger than Avengers Endgame in that country, so it'll be interesting to see if they continue this, not letting too many American films in their country, or if this is just kind of a short-lived pandemic thing. So what did I go over? I went over pandemic, product, piracy, the at-home options. Let's just talk about the shorter window a little bit. So, for the movies that are theatrical exclusive and don't go to PVOD right away, we used to have the 90-day window. The 90 to 120-day window, but mostly the 90-day window. And this seemed to encourage people to go to the theater. Because it was sort of like, this movie opened, and I don't want to be left out of the conversation if other people are seeing it, or, I don't think I'll be able to go on the internet and avoid spoilers for this for 3 months. And so that would encourage people to come out in those, first 2-3 weeks that most people see a movie in. But now we're having shorter windows. So, most of these movies, most of the bigger movies, let's say the movies that the studios want to be big, they're kind of on like a 40 to 45 day window. You saw that with, I think F9 was about on that. Quiet Place 2. You're seeing some of those movies, it was shrunk in half. And those movies did pretty well. But then other movies have been on a shorter theatrical exclusive. Some of them it hasn't hurt. Candyman, which I wasn't too much of a fan of, but a lot of other people liked it. Sherman is hashtag not my Candyman. Why isn't there enough Tony Todd in that movie? I don't care about fucking Sherman. I want to see Daniel Robitaille in my Candyman movie. Neither here nor there. But Candyman was on a 21-day theatrical exclusive window. It had about 2-3 weeks, and then it went to PVOD. But even now, it's still it's still in the top 10. It's still making that money. So it's still doing pretty well in theaters. It ended up crossing like 60 million domestically. It's doing pretty well. But then you saw other movies that were only theatrical exclusive for 2 weeks tops, maybe 3 weeks. So 14 days, 20 days, and they were of different box office. Spiral from the Book of Saw underperformed. It was on PVOD pretty quickly, like 3 weeks tops. You're starting to see that with a lot of other movies. And certainly anything that's released independently seems to be following that now. And so, at that point, is it worth going to see in the theater, or can you just sit back and wait? So, for a movie that's only going to be exclusive for 2 or 3 weeks, now, on the one hand, the vast majority of movies make 50% of what they're going to make, or let me rephrase that. The vast majority of films that were released theatrically, they usually make half of their money, or anywhere from a third to a half of what they're going to make theatrically in that first opening weekend. And then they make usually they make like 90% of what their theatrical gross is going to be in the first 3 weekends. So the idea behind the super shortened window of like 21 days is that you give them 3 full weekends, and then they hit PVOD, and it's like, they've already made the most of the money they're going to make theatrically anyway, so why hold it out any longer? But then as an audience member, if you're not really tied to the theatrical experience like I am, and if you're probably watching this video, you might be too, those people might be like, hey, waiting 3 months to see this movie and be out of the conversation and get spoiled for it, that might be harder. But 2-3 weeks, that's doable. It's doable for that if it's going to be cheaper in the long run to rent it, because let's say there's 4 people in my household, or even just 2 people. 2 people, you break even. $20, $10 a person, boom. If you have at least 2 people who are going to watch that rented movie, you're pretty much spending the same amount of money, and you can order DoorDash or something. But I feel like that also siphons out more money because people are willing to wait that time, whereas they might not want to wait 3 months for a rental. So, are we seeing some of that? Maybe. But at the same time, the argument against that is that the average audience member probably doesn't know what that window is for each individual movie, because there's no great formula at this point. Some movies are day and date with a service you already subscribe to. Some movies are day and date, but you have to pay an upcharge. Some movies are only in theaters, and then the studio doesn't necessarily advertise when that theatrical exclusivity ends. I can't tell you how many Facebook groups, according to movies I'm in, and people who don't like going to the theaters are bitching about, like, where can I stream this? And they don't realize that you can stream it in 14 days, or you can stream it in 20 days, or you can stream it in 40 days or 90 days. They don't know, because the studios don't put that out for the most part, for their own reasons. And they don't read, Deadline Hollywood or Variety or The Hollywood Reporter or any of these like industry trades that usually have it in the log line when they're talking about this stuff. So on the one hand, you could say, yeah, it's stealing from box office grosses because they can wait until the theatrical exclusivity window ends. But on the other hand, how many of the average people know what the window is for that movie they want to see? Let's say you're interested in, Forever Purge, or you're interested in Malignant. You might not necessarily know where it's available. Or, maybe you're someone who just pirates everything. You could be that person. You could just take to the internet high seas. And is Pirate Bay still a thing? I don't know. I don't pirate stuff anymore. But to one of those places, maybe people are just waiting for everything to drop there and they just watch it as it comes. I don't know. Or maybe someone is just, rich and they subscribe to every streaming service, and so they're like, yeah, it'll hit one of these things: Hulu, Paramount, Peacock, HBO Max. I don't know, Tubi. I don't think anything new is coming to Tubi, but it's that would be interesting because it seems like anytime you Google, you go to Google for a movie and you're like, when does something, the auto complete will be like, come to Netflix or come to HBO Max or whatever. So the lack of transparency about what each individual film's window is might undercut that argument a bit, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say if people are just waiting because they know it's going to come to streaming or whatever. And the last thing I want to talk about is, as someone who likes going to the theater, one of the possible bright spots I saw about PVOD is that it might keep the assholes out of the theater who ruin the theatrical experience for everybody. The people who want to treat the movie theater like their living room, put their feet up, take their shoes off, talk throughout it, play on their phone, that type of asshole. Instead of treating the movie theater like your living room, you can watch the movie in your actual living room, and you can talk all you want, and you can be the horrible piece of shit that you are, and not ruin it for everybody else. And so I was hoping that with the option, that the people who are going to the theater are just the hardcore theater people, and those are the people who know how to shut the fuck up and respect the theatrical experience. Is that the case? Kinda? I haven't had any major problems in the theater post-COVID, or inter-COVID, I will say. Occasionally you'll have a movie where some people whisper a little bit more than they should. There was a couple like that when I went to go see Lamb. They didn't ruin my experience or anything, but I could definitely hear that they were a couple who, A, had never been to the Alamo Drafthouse before. Anytime I hear someone next to me when the waiter or the waitress is like, have you ever been here? And they say no, and I'm like, oh, you're gonna fucking talk, aren't you? Sometimes I'm wrong about that, though. But sometimes you have people like that. Or people who, haven't been back to the theater until whenever. It's like, movie theaters reopened back in September or August of 2020, so it's still a little weird when I hear people say that they haven't, next to me or whatever, say that they haven't been to a theater since COVID, because, at the same time, I hate that before every movie in Alamo, after the no talking PSA, they have this montage of clips of people going to the movies, and it's like, welcome back, and it's like, bitch, I've been back for over a year. Stop giving me a hand job and start the movie. I already have 2 minutes of logos to sit through before I can start my narrative. That's neither here nor there. But I haven't had any super obnoxious people in a theater. The closest I had was I went to go see Don't Breathe 2. And for the first 2 minutes of the movie, there was some obnoxious bitch behind me talking about it. Someone warns the blind guy, it's if you keep a leash on her or whatever, and the girl was like, facts! And then finally someone next to them actually just was like, could you shut the fuck up? And then they were fairly quiet for the rest of the movie. I wish Alamo did more to proactively address talkers instead of waiting for people to put up their card, because some people are too nervous to do that. That's my one complaint about Alamo, but in general, most people are pretty respectful. I have seen some movies like Lamb or The Green Knight that are pretty quiet, and they're not really mainstream movies, and people go to see them, probably not realizing how not mainstream they are, and you'd expect people to start talking or whatever. The only problem I had in Lamb is that some of the audience members were laughing at moments that I didn't think were intentionally funny. That movie does have a lot of intentional humor in it, but they were just laughing at every close-up of an animal, so I think some people walked into that movie thinking it was a mainstream horror movie, maybe. At this point, you should know the A24 logo doesn't mean that, but whatever. I mean, it's like everybody who walked into Hereditary and started clucking and didn't know what to make of it, but I digress. So I was hoping that PVOD would get some of those people to just stay the fuck home and stay out of my theater. And I don't know if that's happening, but And it might also be because I do see the vast majority of my movies at Alamo as opposed to AMC or Regal or something. But I haven't had too many problems with obnoxious moviegoers. And I generally, most of the movies I go see after work on a Thursday night when they first open. So I am kind of an opening night person for the most part. So you'd think that that would have more rowdier people than if I were seeing a movie at 2 in the afternoon or something. But I'm hoping that kind of goes forward. Also, I know a lot of theaters don't seem to be doing this anymore, but Alamo, my Alamo at least, they recently, before they had, there was like a buffer of 2 seats between every party, and then they stopped that and they were letting people sit next to each other regardless of what party they're in, and they've since gone back to having a 1 buffer seat between each party, and I like having that buffer seat, mainly because of the drink holder, and I'm always afraid someone sitting next to me is going to knock my club soda over, because I almost always order a club soda with lime at Alamo. Unless I'm seeing more than one movie, in which case I'll order alcohol because I'm not afraid of driving later. That's just a me thing. But anyway, that was just sort of where we kind of are right now. There's still a lot of questions about how pandemic fear is going to help. The fear of the Delta variant seems to have gone down, and certain people can get a 3rd booster shot for the Pfizer thing, and once the kids can get vaccinated, that might allow more family films to open in theaters again, and a lot of stuff is still up in the air, particularly if what will make those older audiences feel safer about coming back to the theater and stuff like that. But anyway, this was just me rambling for 45 minutes or plus about where the state of the movies are as I talk in the middle of October. We're still seeing some big movies get pushed back. Paramount pushed back a lot of stuff. Like I mentioned Jackass and Top Gun Maverick and the new Mission Impossible and all that stuff. But it'll be interesting to see how the rest of this fall and winter and Christmas time does. Will Ghostbusters do okay? How will The Matrix do despite being an HBO Max day and date? How will West Side Story do despite the allegations against Ansel Elgort? All of that stuff. So when enough time has passed and I feel like I have enough to talk about, I'll make another video about that. And I'm still working on some other stuff, but I'm lazy, and I had to spend time binge-watching Squid Game and doing other things. So that's all I have for now. So have a good everybody, and see ya.